Living in this city was like walking through a thick, invisible fog. For Elias Thorne, everyone had a hand in someone else's pocket, and the only thing cheaper than the materials they built with was a man's word. For 20 years, he had been the lead safety inspector, the one man who refused to look away when the steel was thin or the foundation was cracked. It was a lonely existence, carrying the weight of the rules in a place that treated them like suggestions. Every morning, Elias put on his hard hat and his boots, knowing that he was the only thing standing between a functioning city and a graveyard of collapsed concrete. While his colleagues drove cars they couldn't afford on their salaries, Elias drove a sedan and slept with a clear conscience. But a clear conscience didn't pay for Maya's tuition or the rising mortgage, and lately, the weight of being the only honest man felt like a noose tightening around his neck. The Apex Bridge was supposed to be the city's masterpiece, connecting the downtown core to the suburbs. It was the governor's legacy, but when Elias ran the core samples last Tuesday, the truth didn't look like progress. It looked like a death sentence. The concrete wasn't the high-density grade required by the blueprints. It was porous, cheap, and filled with air pockets that would turn to dust under the pressure of daily commuters. It was a calculated theft of public safety for private profit. Within months of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the structure would groan, buckle, and drop into the river below. Elias stared at the data on his screen, his hands trembling. This wasn't just another kickback, this was mass murder in the making. He didn't even have time to file the report before Silas Vance, his supervisor, and a man Elias had called a friend for 2 decades, walked into the office. Silas didn't look like a villain. He set a thick manila folder on the desk and leaned in close. Inside weren't the real samples, but forged reports claiming the concrete was perfect. He told Elias that this one signature would fix everything. Silas spoke about the Thorne family's financial future, about a retirement fund that would ensure Sarah and Maya never had to worry again. He said the bridge was fine, and that the city needed this win. "Don't be a hero, Elias," he whispered. "Just be a father who provides." The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the stench of a soul being bartered. Elias pushed the folder back across the desk. He didn't yell, he just said that his signature wasn't for sale, and that the truth would be on the mayor's desk by morning. Silas didn't argue. He just picked up the folder, his face turning into a mask of cold indifference. He walked out without a word. When Elias left the building later, the sun was setting. He reached his car only to find all 4 tires shredded. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a scrap of paper with 5 words scrawled in a hand he didn't recognize. "Honesty is a luxury you can't afford. If you believe that integrity is the most important human trait, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming stories on the strength of the human spirit. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from." His heart hammered as he looked around the desolate lot. Elias hurried back inside to grab his backup keys, but as he reached for his desk drawer, he heard a faint, rhythmic clicking. It wasn't the clock. He traced the sound to the underside of his desk and pulled away a small black disc, a high-end listening device. His stomach turned. Elias realized then that he wasn't just fighting a corrupt project. He was trapped in a web where everyone he trusted was pulling the strings. The people he thought were his allies were the ones orchestrating the accident that was about to happen, and Elias Thorne was the only thing standing in their way. Elias Thorne stepped through his front door, the smell of damp pavement and exhaust clinging to his coat like a second skin. He found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling around a cold mug of coffee. She didn't ask about his day. She already knew. The slashed tires in the driveway were a message written in shredded rubber and malice. "Elias, please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. "Just sign the papers. I don't care about the money or the integrity of the bridge anymore. I care about our lives. I care about Maya." He looked at his wife, seeing the exhaustion and terror etched into her face, and for a moment his resolve wavered. Being the hero felt like a deeply selfish act when it put a target on the backs of those he loved most. The silence in their home, usually a sanctuary of warmth, now felt like the held breath of a predator waiting in the shadows. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, but his unwavering honesty prevented the lie from leaving his throat. The next morning, at the Department of Infrastructure, the air was thick with a different kind of silence. As Elias walked toward his cubicle, the usual hum of conversation died instantly. Co-workers who had shared coffee and complaints with him for a decade suddenly found fascination in their shoelaces or distant spreadsheets. He was a ghost in his own office, a pariah wearing a neon safety vest that now felt like a bullseye. Silas Vance watched him from the glass-walled upper office, a predatory shadow behind a mahogany desk, his gaze cold and expectant. Within an hour, Elias was handed a new assignment, an emergency structural audit of the condemned chemical tunnels in the industrial district. It was a suicide mission, a place where the air was toxic and the rusted floorboards were mere suggestions of safety. They weren't trying to change his mind anymore. They were trying to remove the man from the equation. Desperate and feeling the walls close in, Elias drove to the outskirts of the city to see Judge Miller. The retired judge had been his moral compass since his first day on the job. They sat in Miller's library, surrounded by the leather-bound wisdom of centuries. But as Elias laid out the evidence of the porous concrete at the Apex Bridge, the old man didn't look shocked. He looked weary, a man burdened by a secret too heavy to carry. "Elias, I designed the system," Miller said softly, the words hitting Elias like a physical blow. The mentor explained that decades ago he had created the kickback loops to grease the wheels of progress. "A little rot is necessary for the garden to grow," Miller concluded, his voice devoid of regret. Elias stood up, his heart breaking in the quiet room. The man who had taught him integrity was the architect of the very lie he was fighting. The isolation turned to terror when he tried to strike back. He contacted a journalist, but she vanished before their meeting. When Elias returned home, the front door was unlocked. He rushed inside to find the house empty. His family had fled to safety. But on the table sat Maya's favorite. Hand-carved wooden doll snapped in half. It was a brutal promise. Instead of crumbling, a cold resolve solidified in Elias's chest. This was a war for the city's soul. That night, he slipped back into the office and opened Silas's safe. Inside was a hidden ledger, a roadmap of every bribe tied to the mayor and the governor. He stepped into the night air, only to be surrounded by sirens. "Elias Thorne," a vocal boomed, "you are under arrest for embezzlement." They had flipped the script. The honest man was now the thief, and the police were nothing more than the hounds of the hunt. Elias Thorne ducked into the shadows as blue lights swept the brickwork. He didn't run toward the main roads. He fled toward the darkness he knew best. He slipped through a rusted hatch, descending into the city's steam tunnels that threaded beneath the modern city like forgotten veins. These were maps the elite never looked at, the crumbling infrastructure he had documented while leaders pocketed the repair funds. In the damp silence, Elias clutched the secret leather-bound ledger. He was no longer just an inspector. He was the only ghost haunting a dying empire. Moving through the tunnels, he overheard a chilling conversation through a grate. It wasn't just about cutting costs. Silas Vance and a shady official were discussing a controlled demolition disguised as a tragedy. They intended to let the Apex Bridge collapse during the grand opening ceremony. They would blame anonymous terrorists, collect several billions in insurance, and use the national mourning to seize political power. Hundreds of innocent, unsuspecting people were walking onto a death trap while the porous concrete groaned beneath the weight of their celebration. Elias found a discarded phone and dialed Sarah. His voice was a jagged rasp as he told her he loved her. He simply didn't promise to come home. He promised that little Maya would grow up in a world where her father hadn't stayed silent. The line was heavy with Sarah's muffled sobs, but she didn't beg him to stop. She simply told him to be the man she had married. He hung up, wiped a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead, and began his final ascent. The bridge was a spectacle of light, a monument to a massive lie. Elias bypassed security by climbing external ladders, his fingers raw from the metal. He reached the control room, a glass sanctuary overlooking the festivities. Inside, 2 technicians were busy synchronizing a glitzy light show. Elias didn't use a weapon. He used his master override key. He locked the heavy doors and slammed his palm onto the console, overriding the pre-programmed sequences to expose the rot hidden within the steel. Instead of fireworks, The massive LED displays spanned the bridge's length, flickered, and died. Then, they surged back with blinding white light. Page after page of the secret ledger began to scroll across the skyline. The names of the mayor and Silas Vance appeared in giant letters next to the bribe amounts. The warnings about the porous concrete were broadcast for thousands to see. The music stopped instantly. The laughter turned to a confused, terrifying murmur as the truth reached every single corner of the dark waterfront. Below, structural sensors began to scream. The weight of the crowd was already doing the work the corruption had started. Elias grabbed the emergency PA system. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, the voice of a man who had finally found his footing. He told the terrified crowd to evacuate. The panic was immediate. People scrambled off the spans, running toward the banks. As the last citizen reached the shore, a sound like a gunshot echoed. The apex bridge groaned, its spine snapping as the shattered substandard concrete finally gave way into the dark river. The bitter aftermath was a whirlwind of justice. The police who came for Elias were not the ones Silas had bought. The massive, undeniable evidence on the screens was an uncontainable wildfire. The corrupt mayor resigned, and Silas Vance was led away in handcuffs. The embezzlement charges against Elias Thorne were dismantled within hours, as the public demanded total accountability from the leaders who had betrayed them. Months later, Elias stood outside a small hardware store. He was finally unemployed, his house in foreclosure. Yet as he watched a young man refuse to sell a faulty tool to a customer, Elias deeply felt a flicker of hope. Elias Thorne walked through the grey city with his head high, a broken yet unwavering honest man, in a world finally learning the value of truth.